Hello and welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, Alexis Knight. Here we take a look at criminal cases where the evidence just is not so black and white and the public cannot decide to agree one way or the other, keeping people divided in their strong stance, debating even still today. In this episode, we unravel the controversial case of Janet Carter and the shooting of her neighbor, Brian Plawer. Was this a desperate act of self-defense? Or was it premeditated murder, fueled by years of simmering tension? With conflicting witness testimonies, a divisive courtroom battle, and questions that still linger, you can consider the facts and decide for yourself. Was it murder or was it self-defense? Let's get into it. In a quiet suburb of Ohio, two neighbors lived side by side, separated by a fence and united by years of simmering tension. Janet Carter, a 58-year-old woman known for her solitary nature, and Brian Plawer, her 60-year-old neighbor, they'd never quite seen eye to eye. Their disputes were petty but persistent. Arguments over property lines, late-night noise, and a long-standing grudge about this tree branch that hung across the fence. But no one could have predicted that one day these minor conflicts would end in bloodshed. On a crisp autumn evening in 2015, Brian Plawer was shot and killed by Janet Carter on his front porch. Janet claimed that she feared for her life after an argument had escalated. According to her, Brian had threatened her and lunged toward her, and she had no choice but to fire in self-defense. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of premeditation and malice. They argued that Janet had been harboring a grudge against Brian for years, and that the shooting was an act of cold-blooded murder. This case has left the community deeply divided. Some see Janet as a frightened woman who felt cornered and reacted in fear, while others believe she is a calculating killer who used the claim of self-defense just to cover up her crime. The evidence is so conflicting here. The testimonies are contradictory, the motives are murky. So we're going to ask along the way, was Janet Carter a woman pushed to her breaking point? Or was she plotting her neighbor's death all along? All right, let's unravel the details of this neighborhood dispute that ended in a tragedy. We're going to look at the moments leading up to the shooting, the complicated history between Janet and Brian, and the evidence that split a community in half. Was this a case of murder, or was Janet Carter genuinely acting in self-defense? All right, well, our scene here is a suburban street in small-town Ohio, where neighbors live in close quarters and the community is tight-knit. Janet Carter and Brian Plawer had been neighbors for over a decade. Both were known to the local residents. Brian was an active member of the community. People saw him as friendly and outgoing. And Janet, she was more reserved, often keeping to herself. Despite their proximity, Janet and Brian's relationship, it's always been contentious. They argued over trivial matters, property boundaries, noise complaints, and the animosity between them, it wasn't a secret either. Janet had made several complaints to the local authorities about Brian's just overall behavior, citing disturbances, property damage. Well, then Brian, in turn, of course, he's accusing Janet of being overly sensitive and confrontational. The night of this shooting, the tension between them had reached its boiling point. But what happened in those final moments? Was Janet truly in fear for her life? Or did she see an opportunity to end a long-standing feud once and for all? All right, so to understand what happened on that fateful autumn evening, we really need to look back at the years of tension that led to this tragic confrontation between Janet Carter and Brian Plawer. For over a decade, these two neighbors had been embroiled in a series of disputes that escalated over time, creating an atmosphere of hostility and distrust. The conflict between Janet and Brian, it began with minor grievances, disagreements over property boundaries, complaints over loud music, accusations of trespassing. And at first, these disputes, they seemed trivial, but then as the years went by, they began to accumulate, feeding a cycle of resentment. Janet was a widow, living alone. She had a reputation for being meticulous about her property. She was often seen tending to her garden and maintaining her home with great care. She accused Brian of repeatedly encroaching on her space, letting his plants grow over her fence and parking his car too close to her driveway, and even allowing his dog to roam on her lawn. Well, Brian, in turn, saw Janet as this overly sensitive woman, quick to anger. He dismissed her complaints as petty and believed she was exaggerating the extent of the problems. Neighbors described him as a friendly man who enjoyed socializing and often hosted gatherings in his home, which Janet frequently reported as noise disturbances. So this tension between the two, it escalated in 2014 when Janet ends up filing a formal complaint against Brian. She accuses him of harassment and property damage, claiming that he had deliberately thrown trash into her yard and damaged her fence during a heated argument. The local authorities investigated, but they found no concrete evidence to support Janet's claims. Well, in retaliation now, Brian files his own complaint, accusing Janet of harassment. He alleges that she's been spying on him, taking photos of him on his property, shouting at his guests. These mutual accusations, they only deepen the divide between these two, and the animosity grows more intense. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, several incidents intensified this conflict. So witnesses reported seeing Janet and Brian arguing in the street on multiple occasions, with voices raised and tempers flaring. Janet confided in a friend that she was actually afraid of Brian, claiming that he had threatened her during one of their arguments, and she says that he hates me, and I am actually worried that he might try to hurt me. Now, meanwhile, Brian was heard telling another neighbor that Janet was just crazy and that he was tired of her constant complaints. He reportedly stated that he did not know what her problem was, but that she was always looking for a fight. So the neighborhood, they're becoming aware of this dispute. They're becoming aware that it's reaching a critical point, with both parties feeling increasingly antagonistic and fearful. Not good emotions. They can cause a lot of quick actions. Well, on the night of October 15th, 2015, that's when things do come to a head. According to witness statements and the police reports, here is how it all went down. All right, so around 8 p.m., Janet called the local police department to report a disturbance that involved Brian. She claimed that he was making loud noises and behaving aggressively near her property. The dispatcher noted that Janet sounded anxious. She sounded upset, but did not classify the call as an emergency. Now, within minutes, Brian was seen approaching Janet's house. Some neighbors reported hearing them arguing loudly, with both voices raised in anger. The specifics of that argument remain unclear, but it was evident that the situation was escalating, and it was escalating very quickly. According to Janet, Brian began shouting and he was cursing at her, and she says that he was accusing her of harassing him. Well, she claims that he moves in closer. He's waving his arms aggressively. He's threatening her. Fearing for her safety, Janet says she retreated back into her house. She ends up grabbing her handgun, that she had in there for protection, and she felt like she needed some protection. She stated that when she returned to the doorway, Brian continued advancing toward her. She says she shouted to him to stop. She claimed that he ignored her warnings and he lunged at her anyway, prompting her to fire 2 shots in rapid succession. Brian was hit in the chest, and then he collapsed on the porch, where he was later pronounced dead by first responders. When the police arrive at this scene, they find Brian's lifeless body on Janet's porch, and Janet is there still holding her gun. She immediately surrenders the weapon and tells the officers, "I had no choice. He was going to hurt me." Janet ends up getting taken into custody, and the police start their investigation, right? Neighbors were questioned, and the crime scene was carefully examined for evidence. While some neighbors reported hearing Janet shout, "Stop," others claimed they had only heard the gunshots and were unsure of what happened beforehand. So the police conduct a very thorough examination of this scene. The gun used was registered to Janet. The bullets recovered from Brian's body match the weapon. The autopsy report confirms that Brian was shot twice in the chest at close range. Okay, the investigators also note, though, there are no signs of forced entry into Janet's home. There were no marks or injuries on Janet, suggesting any kind of physical struggle had taken place. And Brian's body was found a few feet from the front door, suggesting clearly that he may have been standing on the front porch when he was shot. So this can get confusing. Janet, during all of this, remains calm, and she is cooperative throughout her initial interactions with police that she's having. She consistently maintains that she shot Brian in self-defense. She keeps saying she was fearing he was going to attack her. She claimed that Brian had been harassing her for years and that she finally felt threatened enough to act. But, her demeanor, it raised questions. Some officers found her just a bit too calm and composed, especially for someone who had just shot a neighbor. And they wondered if this was a sign of guilt, or maybe it could be just shock. Well, neighbors provide conflicting accounts of the events leading up to this shooting. So one neighbor who had a partial view of the porch testified that they saw Brian standing with his hands by his sides, not appearing to threaten Janet physically in any way. He was just standing there. Okay, but then there's another neighbor, and they get this also. They're claiming that they did hear shouting. They also heard a loud bang, but then they didn't really see the actual shooting. Several other witnesses reported hearing Janet and Brian arguing in the days leading up to the incident, suggesting that tensions were at an all-time high. Some neighbors believed Janet's story of self-defense, noting that she had seemed genuinely fearful of Brian. But others were more skeptical. They felt that she had long harbored animosity toward this guy and may have seen this shooting as an opportunity to finally end this bothering conflict once and for all. Investigators found that Janet had owned the handgun, in this case for several years, and had taken shooting lessons in the past. They noted she was familiar with the weapon and she was comfortable using it. Some speculated that this could imply premeditation. Janet knew exactly how to use her firearm and had chosen to do so in a deliberate manner. Now, based on the evidence, Janet gets charged with second-degree murder. Her defense team immediately argues that she's acting in self-defense in that moment and should not be charged with murder here. The trial was set, and the stage was prepared for a courtroom battle that would put Janet's character, her actions, and her motives under intense scrutiny. Was Janet Carter genuinely afraid for her life? Or did she simply see a chance to end this annoying feud with a neighbor that she despised. I mean, was this a justified self-defense situation? Or was there something more sinister at play? How are your opinions forming out there? Let's continue. The trial of Janet Carter, okay, this becomes the talk of the town, obviously, with the community sharply divided over whether she was actually a frightened woman or she was a cold-blooded killer. Now, in court, the prosecution and defense, they present two vastly different versions of what even happened that night on the porch. Okay, let's take a look at the prosecution's argument that there was a calculated murder that took place here, stemming from a long-standing grudge. The prosecution was led by Assistant DA Rachel Hartman, and she argued that Janet had been harboring this deep-seated animosity toward Brian for years. And the prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was angry, and she was very frustrated. And she was also getting increasingly paranoid, they said, about her neighbor's actions. So in the end, in their view, this was not a case of self-defense, but of premeditated murder. And here's the evidence they presented. All right. She had a history of hostility. The prosecution meticulously laid out the history of Janet's complaints against Brian, pointing to the numerous calls to the police, the formal accusations of harassment, and the bitter confrontations witnessed by neighbors. They argued that Janet had built a narrative of fear to justify her growing hatred for Brian. They say she also had an intent to harm. They presented several witnesses who testified about Janet's repeated statements that she wished Brian would disappear, that she couldn't stand living next door to him. They contended that Janet's resentment had reached a boiling point and that she had full-on decided to take matters into her own hands. They also thought and presented the fact that there really was no imminent threat. I mean, they argued that Janet's claim of this self-defense, it was unsubstantiated, and pointed out that Brian was not armed. There was no evidence he had threatened her physically. And they emphasized that there were no signs of a struggle or forced entry and that Brian was shot at close range while standing on Janet's porch, suggesting that he really posed no immediate danger. And her behavior, okay? Prosecutors also highlighted Janet's behavior after the shooting, and they argued that she was calm and collected, even detached immediately after the incident. They suggested that if Janet had genuinely acted in self-defense, she would have been more emotionally distraught. They portrayed her composure as a sign that she had planned this shooting and she was prepared for the consequences. The prosecution noted that Janet had been a gun owner for years and that she had taken several firearms training courses, and they argued that this showed a level of comfort and familiarity with using a weapon, suggesting that she had not fired impulsively, but with intent and precision. They presented evidence that Janet had recently renewed her gun permit and had been to the shooting range multiple times in the months leading up to the incident, and they argued that these actions were consistent with someone planning to use their weapon, not of someone who is afraid for their life. There were several inconsistencies in Janet's account of the shooting. This was also something. It was brought into light. Initially, Janet claimed Brian had lunged at her, but then later she suggests that he was simply approaching her aggressively. The prosecution argued that these changing details indicated that Janet was attempting to construct a narrative to fit the evidence rather than just telling the truth. They called attention to the fact that Janet made conflicting statements about the events leading up to this shooting, casting doubt on her credibility and challenging her self-defense claim. Now, the defense's argument, very different, right? They're saying this is a woman who was defending herself against a threatening neighbor. Now, this defense, led by attorney Mark Sandoval, presented a very different picture, right? They argue that Janet is a woman who's been living in fear for years, tormented by an unpredictable and hostile neighbor. According to the defense, Janet was a victim of Brian's aggression, and she had no choice but to protect herself. They said she was afraid for her life. They painted a portrait of Janet as this terrified woman who had been pushed to the edge by years of harassment and threats. And this can happen. They argued that on the night of the shooting, Janet genuinely believed her life was in danger. Several of Janet's friends and neighbors testified that she had expressed fear of Brian in the weeks leading up to this incident, with one witness stating that Janet had confided that she felt like a prisoner in her own home because of all of this. The defense introduced testimonies suggesting that Brian had a history of aggressive behavior that should be considered. One witness, a former acquaintance of Brian's, testified that he had a short temper and had been involved in a physical altercation with another neighbor just years earlier. The defense argued that Brian's past behavior gave Janet reason to fear that he might actually harm her. The defense also challenged the prosecution's assertion that Janet had a motive in the first place to kill Brian, like kill him. They argued that if Janet truly hated Brian as much as the prosecution claimed, she had many other opportunities to act over the years. They contended that there was no evidence of premeditation, that Janet had never shown any intent to harm Brian before the night of that shooting. And the defense, they dismissed the prosecution's portrayal of Janet as a calculating murderer. They presented evidence that Janet had never been violent or had any previous criminal record, suggesting that the prosecution's narrative of this long-standing grudge, it was all exaggerated and it didn't align with her character. They also said that Janet didn't have to wait until Brian physically attacked her anyway to have to protect herself. They point out that she had repeatedly warned him to stop advancing toward her, and that his refusal to back down gave her the reason to believe that he did intend to harm her. And so they bring in an expert on self-defense laws who testified that Janet's actions fell within the legal parameters of self-defense. They argued that she was justified in using her firearm to protect herself from a perceived threat, and that she had acted reasonably given the circumstances. The defense team made a point to portray Janet as a reasonable and law-abiding citizen. They emphasized her background as a widow living alone who had felt increasingly vulnerable in her home due to the ongoing disputes with Brian. And they described her as someone who had tried to avoid conflict but had been pushed to a breaking point. They also highlighted Janet's cooperative behavior with the police and her consistent insistence that she had acted in self-defense. They argued that her calm demeanor after the shooting could be explained by shock or maybe even relief that the perceived threat was over, rather than evidence of guilt. So, was there an immediate threat? The crux of the case lay in the determining whether Janet truly believed her life was in immediate danger when she shot Brian, or whether she used self-defense as a convenient cover for premeditated murder. Was she really motivated by that long-standing grudge? The prosecution argued that Janet's history of complaints and hostility to Brian indicated a motive for murder, whereas the defense says, that was too minor. And how credible were all these witnesses? The prosecution and the defense, they both relied on witness testimonies to support their narratives. The defense argued the prosecution's witnesses were biased against Janet, and then, of course, the prosecution's questioning the reliability of the defense's witnesses who had testified about Brian's alleged aggression. Alleged. As the trial continued, the community watched and they waited, divided over whether Janet Carter was a victim or was she a villain. The trial of Janet Carter captivated the local community and quickly became a topic of national debate. While some people saw a clear case of self-defense, others believed it was a premeditated act of murder. The public and media attention intensified the scrutiny, creating an atmosphere where every detail was examined and every opinion seemed to clash. So why does this case continue to stir controversy? Well, from the beginning, the media played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion on Janet Carter's guilt or innocence. Coverage of this case, it was widespread, but the narratives were anything but uniform. Some media outlets portrayed Janet as a frail widow who had been tormented by a hostile neighbor and finally reached her breaking point. They emphasized her age, her solitude, and the years of conflict with Brian Plawer, painting her as a sympathetic figure who had acted out of fear and desperation. Meanwhile, other outlets presented her as a calculated and cold-hearted woman who harbored deep resentment and saw a chance to eliminate a long-standing annoyance. The sensational headlines, "Killer or Victim," created a dual narrative that left the public deeply divided. The conflicting portrayals led to a significant split in public opinion. It affected people. Some felt sympathy for Janet, seeing her as a victim of an aggressive neighbor and a flawed system that didn't protect her. And others were swayed by the portrayal of her as a meticulous planner who had used self-defense as a cover. The polarized media landscape ensured that there was no clear consensus, only a growing divide. And so the media is creating this stir in the public. Do we think that's even fair? The public can go find the information, but when they're hit that hard, do they even go looking? And here's the divide. One of the central controversies in the case was the conflicting testimonies that were provided by the witnesses. There were no cameras. There were no clear recordings. No definitive proof of what exactly happened that night, and it left much to interpretation. So you end up with dueling witnesses, right? Some witnesses claiming to have seen Brian standing calmly on Janet's porch, suggesting that he posed no immediate threat, while others described hearing Janet shout for Brian to stop, implying that she genuinely believed she was in danger. Something was happening. The absence of any concrete evidence allowed both sides to interpret the situation to their advantage. Was Janet a frightened woman defending her home, or was she a calculated individual looking to end a bitter feud? And so this lack of clarity in the testimonies, it raises questions about credibility, because then you start doubting the witnesses themselves. Who should be believed? How can things be so different? The neighbor who saw nothing but heard shouting, the witness who knew both parties but had a personal bias. The inconsistencies in the accounts provided ample ground for doubt, making it difficult for even the most informed observers to feel that confidence in their conclusion. This case, it also tapped into a broader debate about self-defense laws and the use of deadly force. The public was sharply divided on whether Janet Carter's actions were justified or did she cross a line. And people get interested in this because, if it happened to them, how do they know what to do, right? If this kind of happens to me, what happened to this person? Was it okay or not? Many argued that Janet had every right to defend herself on her property. She perceived an immediate threat. They pointed to similar cases where homeowners had been acquitted. Others argued that Janet had overreacted. She used deadly force when it wasn't necessary, and that self-defense should only be a last resort, so Janet must have had other motives. They felt that the use of her gun was disproportionate to the threat she claims, and that she had just simply taken advantage of the self-defense laws to justify a premeditated act. Some said that she was just a fragile woman. Others said, because you think she's fragile, you won't believe she could plan this, because she did. It just went back and forth. And this case had a profound impact on the local community where Janet and Brian lived for years, because it divided neighbors, it strained friendships, and it sparked heated debates in public forums, on the local news, at the town meetings. I mean, this thing got legs, and people really took it personal. They took their decision personal, and there was bitterness and anger to the other side. This case became a flashpoint for broader discussions about neighborhood disputes like this. Personal rights, self-defense. Many in the community were reluctant to even take a side. They just felt the truth would never be known. When the jury delivered its verdict, convicting Janet Carter of second-degree murder, the controversy didn't end. The decision was met with a mix of reactions. Relief from those who believed she was guilty, outrage from those who saw her as a victim of a biased system. And to this day, this debate continues in legal circles, true crime communities, and public forums. Was Janet Carter a killer or a woman pushed to the breaking point? And there you have it. An unsettling story of two neighbors, a decade-long feud, and a tragic ending that left one man dead and a community divided. Was Janet Carter a fearful woman pushed to the brink? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who saw a chance to rid herself of an unwanted neighbor? The evidence is there, but as always, the truth can be elusive. Think about the facts, the years of conflict, the escalating tension, the moments leading up to that fateful night. Was Brian Plawer an aggressor who left Janet with no other choice? Or was Brian just a victim of a long-standing feud that got out of control? Was Janet's claim of self-defense reasonable given the circumstances, or was it just convenient? Consider the witness testimonies, the inconsistencies. Did the jury get it right when they found her guilty of second-degree murder? Or did they miss something in this complicated tale? Ultimately, this case, like so many others, it's about more than just what happened on a single night. It's about how we define justice, how we interpret self-defense, and how we balance fear with reason. What do you believe? Murder or self-defense? Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, truth is not always what it seems, especially in the court of public opinion. You've been listening to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay curious, stay safe, never stop seeking the truth. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.